In 1967, a French psychologist named Michel Gauquelin stood before the scientific community with data that made everyone uncomfortable. He had analyzed the birth charts of over 25,000 professionals and found something impossible. Mars appeared in specific positions for champion athletes more often than chance would allow. The planets, it seemed, were whispering secrets about human destiny, but this wasn't mysticism. This was cold, brutal mathematics staring back at researchers who wanted nothing more than to prove him wrong. Gauquelin didn't believe in astrology. That's what made his findings so dangerous. He started his research to debunk the ancient practice, to finally put the zodiac nonsense to rest with scientific rigor. Instead, he discovered what became known as the Mars effect. Professional athletes showed a statistically significant correlation with Mars occupying certain positions at their birth. Not just athletes, doctors had Jupiter, scientists had Saturn. The patterns repeated across thousands of cases, across different countries, across decades of data. Every attempt to dismiss it as coincidence crumbled under the weight of probability theory. The scientific establishment panicked. Not because they believed in astrology, but because they couldn't explain the data away. The Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, dedicated to debunking pseudoscience, spent years trying to dismantle Gauquelin's work. They replicated his studies. The correlations held. They checked his math. It was flawless. They accused him of selection bias, of manipulating birth times, of statistical tricks. But Gauquelin had been more careful than his critics. He had anticipated every objection. He had used hospital records, official documentation, triple-checked timestamps. The Mars effect refused to die. Then came the German researcher Suitbert Ertel in the 1980s. He wasn't trying to prove astrology either. He wanted to find Gauquelin's mistake, to locate the flaw that everyone knew had to be there. He expanded the dataset, added more athletes, used modern statistical methods. The Mars effect grew stronger, more significant, more impossible to ignore. Ertel published his findings expecting to be celebrated for his thoroughness. Instead, he found himself ostracized, his papers rejected not because of flawed methodology, but because the conclusions were unacceptable to the scientific worldview. But here's where it gets stranger. Gauquelin noticed something else buried in his data. The correlations only appeared for people born naturally, without medical intervention. Caesarean sections, no Mars effect, induced labor? The pattern vanished. It was as if the planets only influenced timing when nature controlled the process. This should have been the detail that exposed the whole thing as meaningless noise. Instead, it made the mystery deeper. How could planetary positions correlate with natural birth timing? What mechanism could possibly connect a mother's contractions to the position of Mars in the sky? The answer nobody wanted to consider. Maybe the planets weren't causing anything. Maybe something else was creating both effects simultaneously. Geomagnetic fields, solar radiation cycles, cosmic ray variations that peaked and dipped with planetary alignments. The Earth sits in a complex electromagnetic environment, constantly bombarded by particles from the Sun, influenced by gravitational pulls from every massive object in the solar system. When Jupiter and Saturn align, they create measurable changes in solar activity. When Mars passes certain points in its orbit, the Earth's magnetosphere responds. These aren't mystical influences, they're documented physical phenomena. Here's what nobody tells you about fetal development. It's exquisitely sensitive to electromagnetic fields. Studies have shown that even slight variations in geomagnetic activity correlate with hormone production, cellular division rates, neural pathway formation. A fetus developing during a period of high solar activity experiences a subtly different chemical environment than one developing during solar minimum. And labor is triggered by a cascade of hormones so complex that science still doesn't fully understand it. Oxytocin, prostaglandins, cortisol, melatonin, all dancing in precise rhythms influenced by circadian cycles, which are themselves influenced by light, which is influenced by solar activity. which is influenced by planetary positions. The mechanism started to emerge, not that Mars makes you aggressive or Venus makes you loving, but that the electromagnetic soup surrounding Earth during your birth month, your birthday, your birth hour, creates subtle but real variations in fetal development and birth timing. And those variations, averaged across thousands of people, might correlate weakly with certain traits or career choices. Not destiny, not fate, just statistical shadows of physics we barely understand, misinterpreted for millennia as cosmic intention. But the scientific community couldn't accept even this, because accepting any correlation, even with a physical mechanism, meant opening the door to everything they'd spent centuries dismissing. Journals refused to publish the research, funding dried up. Gauquelin died in 1991, possibly by suicide, his life's work still controversial, still unexplained, still hanging in the uncomfortable space between dismissal and acceptance. The Mars effect remains one of the most replicated yet ignored findings in psychology. It sits in academic limbo, too robust to debunk, too dangerous to embrace. Then there's John Nelson, the RC, a radio engineer nobody talks about. In 1951, he was trying to predict radio interference for shortwave communications. He needed to forecast solar activity, geomagnetic storms, anything that would disrupt broadcasts. He tried everything: sunspot cycles, solar flare history, planetary positions. Wait, planetary positions? That was a joke at first. Something to test and quickly dismiss, except it worked. When planets formed certain angular relationships, 90 degrees or 180 degrees apart as seen from Earth, radio interference increased dramatically. When they formed harmonious angles, 60 or 120 degrees, communications cleared up. His predictions reached 93% accuracy. Nelson published his findings in electrical engineering journals. He didn't call it astrology. He called it space weather forecasting, but the angles he was using, the planetary aspects he was measuring, they were identical to those used by astrologers for thousands of years. Trine aspects, square aspects, opposition aspects. The same geometric relationships that Babylonian priests had carved into clay tablets were now predicting solar storms with scientific precision. RCA used his methods for decades. They worked. Nobody wanted to talk about why. Because if planetary positions could predict electromagnetic storms, and electromagnetic storms could influence biological systems, and biological systems could influence behavior and development, then somewhere in that chain, buried under layers of complexity and noise, there might be a thread of truth to ancient claims. Not the newspaper horoscope nonsense, not the personality descriptions so vague they could apply to anyone, but something real, something measurable, something that made everyone profoundly uncomfortable because it suggested the ancients weren't completely wrong, just working with metaphors instead of mechanisms. Modern neuroscience added another piece to the puzzle. We now know that birth timing correlates with certain disorders and traits. Summer births show slightly higher rates of myopia. Winter births correlate weakly with schizophrenia risk, spring births with dyslexia. These aren't astrology, they're seasonal effects, vitamin D exposure, maternal infection rates, temperature during pregnancy. But they prove that birth timing carries information. Not destiny, but statistical tendencies. The question becomes, how precise is that timing? Does it matter if you're born in June or specifically on June 15th? At dawn versus midnight, and if it does, what's creating those micro variations? The Gauquelin data suggested it might. Athletes weren't just born under Mars, they were born when Mars was rising or culminating, specific positions relative to the horizon. A matter of hours made the difference between correlation and randomness. That level of precision demands a mechanism more sophisticated than seasonal sunlight. It demands something responsive to planetary positions in real time. Something like geomagnetic field variations, which fluctuate are based on the combined gravitational and electromagnetic influences of every planet in the solar system. But here's the thing that haunts every researcher who goes down this rabbit hole. Even if you prove a mechanism, even if you demonstrate that planetary positions correlate with geomagnetic fields, which correlate with birth timing, which correlates weakly with personality traits, you haven't proven astrology right. You've just proven that a broken clock can tell the right time. You interpret its broken hands as pointing to something other than hours and minutes. The ancient astrologers weren't measuring electromagnetic fields. They were reading omens in celestial patterns. The fact that those patterns might correlate with real effects doesn't validate the mythology. It just means reality is weirder than anyone expected. And that's where the science experiments stopped. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded just enough to be terrifying. They found correlations too strong to be coincidence, too weak to be useful, too controversial to be career safe. Gauquelin's work remains replicated but unexplained. Nelson's methods work but aren't taught. The mechanism sits there, partially visible, like something moving beneath dark water. Science chose to look away because sometimes the most dangerous discovery isn't that we were completely wrong. It's that we might have been accidentally, partially, uncomfortably close to something true while believing it for entirely wrong reasons. The planets don't control your destiny, but they might whisper to your biology in a language we're only beginning to translate.